La benvinguda a Caixa Fòrum Macaya. De seguida començarà l'activitat. Si us plau, comproveu que teniu els telèfons mòbils apagats. Moltes gràcies. Les damos la bienvenida a Caixa Fòrum Macaya. En breves momentos comenzará la actividad. Por favor, comprueben que sus teléfonos móviles están apagados. Muchas gracias.
Molt bé, doncs moltes gràcies. Reitero la benvinguda que acaben de sentir a la Pau
Thank you
Macaya.
very much. I will repeat the welcome you just heard for this new session of the cycle that we've been organizing for a few months now with the IMET, which will be on Mediterranean forests in danger. And it may sound like it's not so dramatic because all human beings have a tendency to misappreciate what is closer to us, what is closest to us. Mediterranean forests, we're not aware of their richness and diversity because they're so close to us that we don't pay too much attention to them. And today we'll have the opportunity to reflect with the aid of the speakers, whom I would like to thank for their presence about this very important topic. So again, thank you to the IMET for the joint organization of this cycle. I would like to thank the speakers and you for attending here today. Have a very fruitful session. Thank you very much.
Hola, buenas tardes, buena tarde, good afternoon. Today we will be speaking in different languages, but I'm gonna speak in English for now. I will be the moderator of this session. Well, thank you so much for coming and welcome to the Met Dialogues 2030. Today we are gonna be focusing on forest stress, because as we all know, we are living in a very changing climate that is affecting forest, water, the soil, and our own livelihood. So we need to discuss today about the main challenges that we are facing, but also about adaptation strategies, because there is a pathway ahead that we can all contribute towards. And I think today we have two very good experts and scientists to tell us more about these solutions that exist and how we can ensure not only adaptation but regeneration of our ecosystems. As I was mentioning, forests are expected to change dramatically in the next year, and we are already seeing the emergency state of the water scarcity, and everything is interconnected. We need to look at the services that the forests provide, not only for our breath, but also for every single human activity that we develop. So how do we confront these challenges? How do we look at the local, regional, and international adaptation measures that are happening by the examples that we already have, by the research that we already have? So we will be covering some successful conservation practices and scientific research as well to tackle these rising temperatures and increasing wildfires as well, and the droughts that we're experiencing. So, well, this is just to say that today we will be doing like a sort of Q&A, like questions and answers that enable some dialogue. And hopefully we can also share with you some questions and answers from their side. So today we have Jordi Varieda Duran. Hello, welcome. He has been a researcher for CREAF, the Center on Research on Forestry in Catalonia, since 1995. He's developing his research on macroecology, so looking on the impact of the disturbances, vulnerabilities on this global change in forest. And he's looking at the demography, carbon balance, growth, mortality rates, and regeneration at a large scale. So we will be looking at the macro level with Jordi. And he has been working also on European projects and also producing reports for the government to support the understanding and actually policy measures to tackle this. And we also have online Dr. Michele Bossano. He is the head of the Mediterranean and Genetic Resources Facility at EFI, the European Forest Institute. He is also a scientist, an expert in the field of forest landscape management and restoration, and he has broader conservation knowledge, working on indicators, monitoring on trees diversity canopy. So welcome as well to you, Michele, if you are somewhere there. Yes, I can see you in my back. So without more hesitation, I will give the floor to Michele to present a few more details on his scope of work and give us more details on his research.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really sorry for not being there with you. I will speak English. I hope the translation goes smoothly. Unfortunately, I tested COVID positive this morning, so this is the reason why I cannot be with you now. I'll give you this general overview, and then I will look very much forward to arriving to a point of having a discussion with the audience to share with you some of the current perspectives. I will start from very, very far away, but the point what I want to present is that the kind of forests that we have now in the Mediterranean are the result of human intervention, of the geology that we have, and the climate, that all of them shape up the forest for what we can see today. If we start from very, very long ago, from 53 million years ago, what we can recognize somehow as the Mediterranean was very, very different. And through the millions of years, the land, the Pangea, moved from a tropical part going northwards and arriving more or less 5 million years ago to something that could somehow look like what we know that we have now. This is the geology. The kind of forest cover in the deciduous forest that we can see now in the north part of the Mediterranean, if we look at 14 million years ago, this was much norther and broader, much broader. But if we look at 53 million years ago, was really very far away, actually, and the two poles of our globe. This to give an idea of the fact that the kind of ecosystem that we are used to see now has been really moving a lot. But looking at something closer to us, the glaciation cycle, and this is something that is simply looking at a more recent time, we have observed something like 20 different glaciation periods in our Earth, and glaciation means that the ice covers part of the globe and then goes away. I'm telling you all this because I want you to have this view of the fact that climate has always been changing. If we look at the last glacial maximum, which is only 20,000 years ago, you can see on the left side, this is the Earth seen from the top. So you can hardly recognize the Mediterranean, you can see the Caspian Sea, and it was like this. Only 20,000 years ago, most of the North Europe was completely covered by ice. Now you can see the ice is remaining only in the pole. If we look at from the side, what we can observe is the fact that while in the American continent, it's possible for species to migrate from north to south, in Europe, because of the Mediterranean, it's very difficult to have this kind of migration. And this has very important consequences of what can happen in the Mediterranean. What you can see here is where the trees, the forestry species, were finding a refuge during the various glacial periods. As I mentioned, we had several glaciation phases in this part of the globe, and every time the species from the north, they were coming to the south, and then going back to the north, and then to the south. So this, they were having this refuge, and they were recolonizing the landscape. This you can see again the maximum glacial of 20,000 years ago. As you can see, most of Europe was covered. Here in this part of the Mediterranean, it was still possible to have trees growing. And as I said, this was the refugia of all the trees, of all the tree species. And then they were migrating, they were colonizing north. But how do trees migrate? Well, this drawing makes us smile, and I think is normal that we think that this is not what is going to happen. But the point, and now I'll stop sharing my presentation so that Jordi will have no problem with his neck, is the fact that when we think about immigration, we all think about animals that they start moving from one side and they arrive all of them to the other side. With trees, this is not happening because the trees, they cannot just take the route and run away. So the only way the trees have to migrate is to reproduce, they regenerate. So we have one tree that will have seeds and they will go 20 meters away, 200 meters away, and then it will need to evolve in another tree again. And only when it will make seeds again, they can move. Why I'm telling you this? Because we have to understand that the trees that they can have a generation every 20, every 40, every 100 years, it takes a lot of time to migrate, a lot of time to colonize new area. We have entire ecosystem that now, because of the climate change, they need to migrate, they need to move to new habitat, they need to move to new landscapes. And we have human infrastructures in between. We have the road, we have agriculture, we have forests that we manage in the way that we want them to be, that prevent this evolution, prevent the possibility of the tree species from moving. So the migration is something that is really crucial and is something that we really need to understand that have to happen. So this means that the forest that we see now will need to be different in the future. We need to allow to have forests that maybe now are on the other side of the Mediterranean to arrive on this side of the Mediterranean. We have faced a summer that was extremely hot in here in Catalonia, but in all the Mediterranean, in all the world, it was an exceptional summer. Unfortunately, there will be many summers like this to come in the future. This means that the poor tree, that they can do nothing, they can just be there and try to reproduce, try to adapt as fast as possible. I'm sure that Jordi in his presentation now will tell us a little bit how to make a forest more resilient. And this more resilient very often is having more diversity. Diversity because the ecosystem is more stable, but diversity is also because we don't know what are the species that will be adapted better in the future, but the many we have, not the many, more complex structure is the ecosystem, more resilient will be. And we have scientific evidence that can help us in knowing how we can guide that. You mentioned before this bioeconomy, the ecological transition. So we are looking at nature, we are looking at the forest, we are looking at our ecosystem to move from economy that is based on fossil fuel to economy that is green, the economy that allows us to benefit for a number of services. Many of those services, they come from the forest. The problem is that we cannot just wait for the forest to adapt to what will be the new conditions. We need to help the forest to make this transition. We need to help the forest to adapt faster to climate change. In some cases, is allowing ecosystem to move. In some cases, is changing the structure. In some cases, allowing also to have species that disappear or that we remove from the landscape in the past. So this active help that we give to the forest is managing the forest, is making sure that there is someone in the landscape that can use the forest. It can be grazing, it can be using the timber, it can be cultivating something close to the forest, but abandoning the landscape now is the worst thing we can do for our forest. There will be many other things that I would like to share with you, and I look very much forward to the discussion, but I promise to be brief, and then I'm sure that with Jordi, that will put many other elements into the picture. There will be a very nice and engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele. So I think that was a very nice introduction to set the scene, and I will give the floor to Jordi to keep building on the narrative and give us an overview on his side.
Okay. Si me ponéis la presentación.
Right. Can I have the presentation on, please? Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to this Met Dialogue session. I'm going to give a more local view. I'm not going to go back to ancient Paleolithic times or beyond. And I'm going to focus more in a more local scale, especially in Catalonia, trying to respond to what we can do to reduce vulnerability of Mediterranean forests to the challenge of global change. And I would like to tell you what is shown or what has happened this last summer. Not this last summer. This is an air view of an area in La Garrocha in Catalonia. I'm sure many of you know it. These are very dense forests coming from that made us have forests with irregular structures, very regular structures, sorry, same size trees. And these are the consequences. We are going or undergoing very extreme droughts. In fact, we are in an unprecedented drought for this century and part of the previous century as well. And this is repeating itself. This is an area in Olsona where we have some Sylvester pine trees, wild pine trees, pine tree forests. As you can see, these trees died. And now this to the right is this past summer, and we are in a practically final situation because the drought continues to be the same, or I would dare to say even bigger or worse. I'm not going to go back a long time, but our forests are a consequence of the phylloxera that came in through France, through the Ampurdá, and kept on invading and attacking all the vineyards. And that was the first and great transformation of the use, agricultural use, and the invasion, as you can see to the right, on the photo to the right, the invasion of these plots, of these vineyards to the sides of the mountains. That is where forests naturally invaded and recolonized all these areas. And this has a great natural capacity to recolonize the different sites. This is precisely a photo of the beginnings of the 20th century and how it was recolonized. These forests can be burned again. This is a fire of 1986, but naturally, once again, Mediterranean forests respond with that adaptation capacity, with that resilience, with that capacity to recover after several disturbances. And we have records. We have records of this type of droughts. And these droughts, as we can see, are very much related precisely to the temperature abnormalities, these super high temperatures that we are experiencing, and also abnormality of the abnormally low rainfall that we're having. And if that is combined, as in the last summer and the previous summer, we have the consequences, as you can see here, of big amount of surface area affected in our forests. And this can be analyzed, and we can see that not all species respond equally to these climate abnormalities. I'm not going to describe these plots, but you can see the curves and how different they are depending on the species we are dealing with. Not all species respond equally, so we can somehow know how they are going to respond in the future before climate scenarios that will come along. They've already started to come, but there are more to come. So to the right, we have a model that we did with these informations, and it basically shows us what areas will be more vulnerable to droughts in the face of drought situations such as the one we see to the left, which is what's happened this summer. So depending on the model that we did, all the areas in red are affected by droughts. Fortunately, it has not been that serious. These models are good, but not good for everything. So anyway, as Michela was saying about migrations before, what will happen with this species? at the end of the century with climate change? Well, here we can see an image that for some species, well, in black, we see the areas where this wild pine tree, a more European pine tree of high mountain, it'll reduce the sites where it can live a lot at the end of the century. But some others, like the typical Aleppo pine, typically Mediterranean one, is a species that increases from left to right. As you can see, the black area, these models tell us that this species is going to be better off. And this has consequences on ecosystems. I'm not going to go into this because we can talk about this later in the discussion.
Para decir que
I would basically stop here to say that the consequences or the consequence of all this story that has been taking place in our forests, so basically consequences of human management, but also climate, means that we have very young forests with small trees, trees that have a long way ahead to continue growing, very few species of trees, so very little diversity, very few trees, and sometimes some species coming up, a very simple structure, all trees the same size, and therefore, well, logically, we have seen this with a high vulnerability to drought and to wildfires. I haven't spoken about wildfires, but these structures are obviously very vulnerable to wildfires. So that low quality of timber, this timber is small and has not really good financial perspective. And this means that there's a very low profitability of our forests. And this makes it even more difficult to have management to do adaptation of these forests. I had a few more slides, but maybe I can leave it here and we can continue discussing. And that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jordi. Thank you so much. I believe what you're saying about the change of species is very important. Wild pine tree or the Aleppo pine, we see so much in our climate. How this, or what can we do to truly adapt, as you were saying, with pine tree, so that they adapt? What are the strategies? Because when seeing this list of challenges, oh my, we need to find those adaptation strategies, don't we? Well, there can be many strategies, but the one that can be useful is that naturally forests, when we abandon forests, new species come up. They start growing and they are more adapted to that area. So if we go to these mixed forests with diversity of species, if that species there starts to die, what we can do is to help the underlying species to occupy the space left by the species that is suffering more. This would be a very simple adaptation regarding climate change. Therefore, the message would be, and Michele already spoke about this, species diversity in a forest is a great ally for the adaptation to climate change. And that is a simple measure. It is just basically to accelerate the processes of species changing in forests. When you see the photo in the Osona region, as we saw before, there were pines there, but there were oak trees and holm oaks underneath. So the forest remains there. The species changed, but the forest remains. Yes, very interesting. And also with the succession of species, they help each other, don't they? Yes. The environment is changing so that the species underneath can germinate and grow, and with the other one, the one on top, the one that is suffering is more exposed, of course. Michele?
Okay, maybe we don't see Michele on the screen. If you could put it back.
maybe I can start saying a couple of things to complement
Yes.
what you were saying.
No.
Hola.
What we actually need is to have someone in the landscape, someone in the forest, they can see the forest and understand what are the needs of the forest. We need to have professional practitioners. We need to have professional forest managers that can see what are the needs of the landscape. Like Jordi was saying, if we look at the big picture from the space and we have all the models, we can see how the species are moving. So we need to pass this information to the forest manager on the ground that knows that Pinus sylvestre is not an option anymore in grand part of South Europe. And on the other side, the practitioner is the one that can see what is happening. The forest manager that responsible for the site can see if a species is doing well or doing bad and trying to see which species can favor and which one not. On the other side, we need to make sure that it has the possibility of introducing new species that maybe we remove in the past, or new species that can take too long to arrive there. Jordi mentioned Roble, the quercus species. Those species can take very, very long to arrive, especially if we remove before, because we didn't want to have them. So in the moment we know that is about to happen, well, why don't doing it so it can happen faster? And then I want to add also another thing, something very, very important that Jordi mentioned. The ecosystem services that we receive from the forest are extremely important for us. But you know, the forest, the wood that we can take out of most of the Mediterranean forest, it has a very, very, very low value. So the owner of the forest need to manage the forest in a way that very often the cost for managing is not paid off by the timber that they can sell. So this is something that is very important for us, that we don't, I don't know how many of you that are there live in the forest, but or live because of the forest, but we live in a society that really need to have forests that are very well managed. But then there are very few that manage the forest, and they also have to make a living out of it. But maybe this opens to new kind of debates. Please, back to you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thank you so much, because again, the ecosystem services is a very key part. And going back to what Jordi mentioned about, like, not all the Mediterranean forests are going to be impacted the same way, right? Because we saw it in the images. Maybe for you, Michele, do you think that there are any of them better off than others? And what consequences for the Mediterranean forestry bioeconomy this implies?
So we have different ecosystems, like I was saying before. An ecosystem is very simple, having just one species, it will have more problem than an ecosystem that is very diverse. But then, I don't know if you remember at the beginning of my presentation, I said that the forest is the result of three elements. So one is the geology, the other is the climate, and the third one is the human impact. So this also, the kind of condition that we have in the forest, it will also depend how much these can adapt to the ecosystem. In some areas, we simply will have very, very little water. And there is very little we can do about that. So some species will not survive. In other part of Catalonia, then we will still have a lot of rain. Maybe it will be concentrated in a different way. So we'll have a lot of rain coming all together, and maybe a longer dry season. So these are all kind of consequences that can have a different impact. And then, well, the model that Jordi was showing before are very illustrative in this. Some species will gain space. Some species will just disappear. So from our point of view, we can either wait this from happening, or using this knowledge that we have to making it happen faster, so that we will not have a moment the ecosystem will collapse. And the ecosystem that collapse is something that is very bad for us, because it means that there will be a flooding, they will lose the soil, there will be a huge disaster, pests that will kill all the trees. In the moment we know that something is about to happen, just make it happen faster.
Thank you. I think you touched on my next question, what was the consequences of not adapting our Mediterranean forest, and that's the chaos, the collapse of the system if we don't take the measures that we are discussing. And what will be the impact in human life? And for example, from your side, Jordi, what do you think?
Bueno, Michele justamente ha hablado de los servicios ecosistémicos que nos...
Michele now talked about the ecosystem services provided by nature itself, and particularly forests. Today we're talking about forests. So perhaps the service that I consider to be the most relevant, or one of the most relevant ones, is that forests, the ground ecosystems, especially forests, are the first CO2 drains. They take up atmospheric CO2 that we emit and issue with the burning of fossil fuels. And calculations are very proven and evidenced. There's been work done to quantify all this. And in terms of the entire globe, the entire world, these systems capture 25% of CO2 emissions, or the greenhouse gas emissions of the entire globe. The other 25% is kidnapped or abducted by oceans. So there's 50% emitted to the atmosphere every year. But if we had no oceans absorbing CO2 or forests absorbing CO2, that other part, 100% would be emitted. So if we are increasing to 2 to 3 ppms of CO2 per year, we would be doubling that proportion of CO2, 6 ppms emitted to the atmosphere. So the acceleration of climate change would be even more dramatic. This, for me, is a very clear way of saying, well, yes, forests are good for something and we need to take care of them. And I always like to bring things down to the local scale, and we have figures. So we have figures for Catalonia, and it turns out that we're not doing that great in terms of CO2. We absorb 10% of the 100% emitted by Catalans, only 10%, which is quite less. So we could say that we would need 10 times more forest area in Catalonia, and we can't fit it in. We can't fit it in to absorb 100% of our emissions. That would be the very quick and simple perspective. Logically, forests have many other ecosystem services that are absolutely paramount and essential. Michele mentioned erosion, prevention, but soil is maintained and kept fertile, and floods are prevented, and diversity itself of the forests.
Es el que alberga de los ecosistemas.
The forest ecosystem of the terrestrial ecosystems is the one that has 70% of biodiversity. It's associated to forests, 70% approximately. So all that biodiversity held in forests, all the functions done by these species in forest contribute to these ecosystemic services to continue actually operating and working. So that would be the approach of the importance and relevance of forests regarding these services. Yes, I do understand, given the figures you are giving us. In Catalonia, for instance, simultaneously, the idea is that we need to reduce the way we produce with fossil fuels to be able to balance, not just with the forest restoration, but we need to reduce, otherwise figures don't add up. So producing and emitting less in order to truly reach or strike a balance. Thank you for the example of bringing it to the local perspective, because we have figures and we can understand it better.
Do you have any examples of initiatives of projects at the FE that have been successful in promoting landscape restoration or this kind of ecosystem management?
Well, actually, less than 1 year ago, the European Forest Institute in the Mediterranean facility here in Barcelona, we released the Mediterranean Forest Research Agenda that basically make an assessment of what are the needs for the, well, in terms of research for the Mediterranean forest. In the moment we released that, we also organize an event, we call it the Mediterranean Forest Forum, here in Barcelona, where foresters from all the Mediterranean, on both sides of the Mediterranean, came to Barcelona, and we made an analysis of what are the concrete actions that are needed in order to speed up the adaptation to Mediterranean forest. Yes, restoration is an important action that we can take, but like like Jordi was saying, no caben, all the landscape is used for something. It's not that we can think of having thousands or millions of hectares where we can plant a new forest. We can just manage better the forest that we have. We can make sure that restoring a forest landscape, meaning planting new trees where there are already trees, mean managing the trees better, means also making sure, you mentioned before, the transition to the bioeconomy. Bioeconomy means making use of the timber that our forests produce. So making sure that instead of buying timber from a tropical country, we buy timber that is produced in Catalonia, and then we can make furniture, we can make building with this timber. We can manage the forest so that they can produce better quality wood, and also having a system behind that can have diversity of those forests.
Thank you, Michele. And I think, Jordi, you also have an example of the use of forest capture for the biomass. Well, a report that you did for the government on kind of, forest biomass for energy and the calculation.
Yes, sí. Hicimos, sí, estos cálculos.
Yes, we did these calculations, but this was quite a long while ago. Now I can't remember the figures, but at any rate, it is true that that part of ecosystemic services, which is timber provision or energy, this is also a very relevant part, because at the end of the day, you either preserve it as kidnapped CO2 in the shape of furniture, a piece of furniture, and that's a good way because it is kept with the long life of a piece of furniture, that is CO2 that is there, kidnapped, or the use to warm up, like wood, firewood, or biomass, which is basically replacing fossil fuels to heat up, to warm up, boilers, and it's another way of mitigating the effect of climate change. I wanted to go in deeper into restoration. We have many ways of restoring forests. It looks like that's the way to go. And restoring also means using nature to be able to do things better. Management can be done in many different ways. One can manage in a very simple way and say, hey, well, I'm going to have a plantation here. I'm going to allow for all trees to grow equally. Every once in a while, I'll bring some out because there's too much of density so that those that remain will grow properly. But this is a system that, with the current climate crisis, can easily reach collapse, as Michele was saying before. If you have all trees of the same size and the same species, there's a heat wave that comes along or an extreme drought, and you will be left without a forest overnight and with nothing at all. So you need to think about some management strategies that will lead you to what we've always said. Okay, well, not placing all your eggs in the same basket. Let's diversify. Before I talked about species in the case of Osona, saying, well, luckily enough, there is home oaks underneath, but we can also think about the structure. And Michele also said that diversifying the structure of the forest is something good. So having lots of trees of lots of species and lots of different sizes. Very big trees that continue to grow, some others that are smaller. And, well, in this succession, all the way to the trees that are just born. So maintaining the forest continuity and having a more moderate management, not bringing all the timber at the same time, but just bringing it out in a way that you're protecting the soil. Yes, totally, that's key.
presentation about the importance, role of genetic biodiversity. Can you elaborate more on the role of genetic biodiversity in enhancing the resilience of forests facing stress?
Of course, thank you. When we look at trees of one species, even if they can look all the same, like it's just like humans, it's just one species, but we have different individuals, and different individuals can react in a very different way. In this moment, I have COVID. I'm only tested and I know that I have COVID, but I have no consequences. My colleague has been in bed for 2 weeks because of having COVID, and this is because we have a genetic diversity between the two of us, and we have reacted to a virus in a different way. And this is the very same thing for the plant. If we have genetic diversity in the forest, trees will react in a different way to new pressure, and the pressure can be a biotic pressure, can be a fungi, can be an insect, or can be a climatic pressure. So if we have this genetic diversity, we have an insurance that the forest will have a different speed, a different possibility in adapting to climate change. And this is really something that is very crucial. Actually, in Europe, we are coordinating an initiative so that all European countries together are developing strategies to make sure that the genetic diversity of the forestry species is conserved throughout all the distribution range of the species. We don't know what kind of climate we will have in the future. We don't know what kind of pest will wipe out completely one species or two species or many species from our landscape. So the best insurance we can have now is trying to conserve all the genetic diversity that we have in our forest, in our landscape. Because once a genetic diversity is lost forever. It's something that we can never recover.
Thank you very much. I think we can move now maybe towards more like the adaptation policies. I don't know from your side, Jordi, if you can mention, can adaptation policies be implemented at different scales, at all scales, local, national, regional?
Sí, en este sentido.
Yes, in this sense, Europe is lately bringing out some directives and strategies, and one that in this regard is new and is very much related to what we're saying here today in this conversation is the new European forestry strategy, which basically goes for that keyword of restoration, of forest restoration. So having a type of management that could be called close or closer to nature. That type of closer management is what I was explaining now, but helping or using nature to making the most. We always talk about ecosystemic systems and services. We need these forests to live, not just for them to absorb CO2, but because they provide us with timber, and there's pollination and any other product we can bring out of forests. So everything that is related to a more adapted management to what nature is already doing naturally, if we're capable of mimicking that type of management, it will be in principle easier to have the management, and easier means even financially viable, more viable, because you simply go to the forest and you do some small interventions, not very strong, some tweak and retouching so that the forest gives you the products you need. That would be the philosophy of this more closer management to nature. Michele knows much more than me about this for sure. I'm just here giving some notions.
Important to understand is that there is no one size fits all. Each forest will have different needs. Each forest will be able to give a different kind of support to our bioeconomy, to our well-being in the future. As I was saying before, we need to have the global picture. We need to see how things are changing. We need to understand how precious, how valuable are the forests. But then we need to have people that are capable, people meaning forest managers, meaning the practitioner, the one that depend on the forest, that are capable of understanding how the forest is performing and to know what kind of changes they need to bring into the forest. Maybe
okay.
If I can add something that to me is really crucial, is the fact that we really need to have people in the landscape. We really need to have people that they live out of the landscape, out of the forest. We need to have shepherds that bring the cabras, the goat and the sheep into the forest. Because if we have too much biomass, then when the forest fire arrives, there is no way we can stop it. And these animals are very important for us. And we have people that make a living out of it. So it's important for us to understand that those people are really giving a service to us. So it's important to buy the local meat. It's important to buy the local timber, as I said before. It's important to see that there are people that live in the landscape that are giving us an enormous service.
And looking more at the kind of like cross-border collaboration, do you know if there are countries working to implement adaptation measures for their forest?
Yes, in all Europe, at different level, we are all struggling with the same principles. I can say that looking at the Mediterranean as a whole, we can see a big difference between the north and the south. As you can imagine, in the north, the biggest problem that we face is land abandonment. This is why in my intervention, I keep repeating that it's important that we have people in the landscape. While in the south, very often we have overuse of the landscape, especially close to the city, close to the villages. While in the north, we have really, well, Spain is a good example, enormous portion of the landscape that are completely inhabited, that there is no one living in it. So this kind of this huge diversity brings different pressure, different motivations. We have some very good examples here in Catalonia in terms of adapting the forest to climate change, adapting the forest to be more resilient to forest fire, to more resistant to forest fire. The Diputación de Barcelona has a special program that put together the forest owner, so that they help them in managing the forest, and they bring the shepherd so that they can graze, and then support the shepherd to sell the cheese and the meat. So this kind of actor, they can really make a huge difference. Something will not happen naturally, but if you have a centralized authority that can help this from happening, this can make a huge change.
Thank you, Michele. And maybe for you, Jordi, he mentioned about the abandoning lands, no, in the northern Mediterranean region, and I think this was part of our cultural heritage, no, of the transhumance, of people living in the rural areas, but we transition towards living more in urban areas. Do you think that there can be a kind of like we can build on these learnings to build new climate adaptation resilience, or not?
Sí, bueno, intentar recuperar un poco ese tipo de...
Yes, well, trying to recover. It's complicated. I see this as something complicated because a lot is said about recovering the rural environment, etc. But this recovery is a type of recovery that needs tradition. It is very hard to become a farmer out of nothing and to go out with your sheep. This is complicated. There's been some attempts. There is the farmer school of Pallars, and they're doing a very nice work, and they're managing to have some achievements, but it's very hard. It's very hard for this type of processes. These really are ecologic processes that work, and this is before there was herbivories, there were wild species that performed this work. When that was lost, that work was done with farmers, and it is true that we're seeing many problems that could be just solved with this type of management of the territory of the land with shepherds, for instance, but a great effort should be done to recover that so that it finally could have the effects that we would need to recover these processes so they can truly achieve the work of herds in the mountains to maintain and manage these big open spaces. And logically, we would have a mosaic soil with less likelihood of wildfire propagation, but it's difficult. A lot is said about this. There's the hope there. We're going to recover all the system. But yes, I'm a bit pessimistic regarding this. I have to say, yes, it's a very recurrent topic. I work in a communication agency in a journal specialized in sustainability issues, and we do find small initiatives in Spain that are trying to revive the rural economy with an approach towards young people, with more creative initiatives of reusing the residue, the waste, looking at waste as a resource, trying to create new business models, going back to the decentralization of population to create greater resilience. At the end of the day, resilience is this is what makes us much more resilient, isn't it? This is a very interesting topic as well, because we were saying that this is one of the most relevant topics in the north of the Mediterranean, the loss of soil management, and that means that it's more exposed to nature, even our own dependence of resources. But I think that I've asked all the questions I had, and it's now a good time to open it up to the audience, see if there's any questions so that you can also answer them. The experts can answer them. I don't know if anybody has a question.
Perfecto.
Yo quería preguntar
I
sobre
wanted to ask about the effects of management against wildfires. How is biodiversity affecting in this renewal of forests, the different ages of the forest?
I can start, and then Jordi, you complement. Is it okay?
Sí, puedo. Hay estudios que dicen que el fuego de alguna manera en el bosque mediterráneo
Studies say that wildfires in the Mediterranean forests allows for biodiversity to increase. But we need to look at this differently, because when you have a wildfire, what happens is that the space is opened up and there is a huge amount of species that cannot live or couldn't live there. And now they have the opportunity of germinating, blossoming, and growing. So you increase biodiversity momentarily. And that would be the open space biodiversity. That biodiversity is very important because precisely that's the biodiversity that will allow that we're losing the most, basically, in our territories, because as we said before, we have more and more forest. I didn't say this quite this way, but we have more and more forest. People may think, no, there's less and less forest because there's wildfires and there's residential areas and catastrophes, droughts. No, it turns out that we have more and more forest. The forest keeps gaining space to agricultural spaces. So all those species that are precisely in this open species are the ones that are dropping in our territory. So forests are good. They are good from this perspective. Logically, what we don't want to have are great wildfires destroying vast amounts of territory, especially if they're burning down houses or people, obviously. But wildfires are a good system to recover those open spaces and precisely to try and recover that biodiversity. It is a bit of a controversial thing, this is. Michele? Well, I wasn't really referring to the wildfire itself, but rather management against wildfires. So these areas that remove all this stratum, I believe it's also important. It's important for water management, etc. So how is this? I understand it's necessary. Apologies, but the sound is too bad from the microphone.
I think I can try to reply because actually I had a very similar question when I was first exposed to the way forests are managed here in Catalonia to prevent forest fire. Because managing a forest to make sure that it's less likely that it will burn when there is a forest fire, meaning simplifying it a lot, meaning eliminating sometimes completely the lower part of the forest and to leave in only maybe one or two species. And then having the grazing, which is fine, they can protect, but then it means that the forest is really very much simplified. So if you look at the single piece of forest, yes, we see that there is a loss of biodiversity. We see that actually that forest is not evolving at all. It's just simply a buffer zone that will stop the forest fire. That's why we need to look at the full picture. We need to look at the entire landscape. And then it is also why, once more, it's important to have local authorities that they can coordinate all the actors that are involved, all the forest managers, they can see the landscape, the various patches of the landscape. So when we look at how we can prevent big forest fire, because are the big forest fire that we want to have, is like Jordi was saying, forest fire is something that has always existed in the Mediterranean forest, and we will always exist, and is needed for many species. But what we don't want to have are the big forest fire, the one that we cannot control, the one that will kill people. So we need either to let the forest fire happen, or sometimes to burn the forest ourselves, to have this preventive small forest fire that will continue, that maintain a special ecosystem, that help some new species to enter, or some species that were disappearing to entering, but then will prevent the big forest fire happen. So as I was saying, if we see the full picture, if we see the entire landscape, we will have some portion of the landscape that are devoted only to have few tree species of the same even age area, the same size, so that the animal can graze, and then the forest fire there will not be a low one, so that it will be much easier also for people to go there and to stop the fire. But if we look at the full picture, then we will need to have areas where we concentrate and we have a high level of diversity. And then it's not that one forest, it will always be like this. There is a moment in the forest that is like this. Then when it arrives the moment that forest need to regenerate, then is the moment where we will have evolution. The moment that there will be no grazing, the moment that there will be new species coming in, maybe planting new species to have the forest evolve into something else. So I will say my reply will say that we don't have to look at the individual forest, but we need to have to look at the entire ecosystem. Does this reply your question?
Perfecto. Creo que teníamos otra pregunta por aquí detrás.
Perfect, thank you. I think we have another question there at the back. I wanted to ask about the list of species that is about to disappear and those that are going to or come over. There's the pine sylvestre, and then there's the Aleppo pine. Because Michele repeated, it's very important to have the necessary stakeholders in place. So we understand that with shepherds it's difficult, but the government has employees who are there and monitor, are we covered at this level, or do we need more staff and employees in charge of that? I don't know if I can answer that, but regarding the first one, most of the tree species won't disappear. They will be reduced to just some places. Very likely, in very extreme cases, at the end of the century, if things go south, I don't know. But at the end of the day, this is the replacement of species because of climate change, but this has happened in a very accelerated way. That species, Pine sylvester, could it disappear from the Iberian Peninsula? Yes, it could, but not from the world, because Pine sylvester is widespread in Russia. So we could see some local extinctions, but these wouldn't be the species we should be concerned about necessarily. We should be more concerned about species that are in very small populations, that are truly rare species and that logically are very much threatened. If you destroy that habitat, automatically you have a very high risk of losing that species. We're now talking about endemic species, species growing up only in one specific place, and the only place where you need to preserve that species is precisely there. And then you need to take all the necessary measures for that to not happen. I think there was another.
Reply to the second part of the question, because
Go ahead.
because we mentioned that it's important to have people in the landscape, but the job are different from the job that we had in our cultural heritage. So the transhumanza, having people that they take the sheep and they move from one side to the other side of the peninsula is something that nowadays no one will want to do. We all want to go back home every evening. So we need to understand that this kind of job are evolving. So what we need to do is to make sure that the people that we want to that make a living in the rural area, they can have easy life also with the bureaucracy, so that it is easier for them to make a living out of it, not dealing with too heavy bureaucracy. And on the other side, having an appreciation, and in some cases, it's that just choices that we do in buying products that come from the local areas. So we really depend very much on the people that can live in the landscape, but we need to support an evolution of this kind of jobs. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. En primer lugar, gracias por vuestras intervenciones.
Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you for your contributions. My question has been partially answered, because I wanted to say, whenever there's a change of species in an area, this could have consequences on the fauna, not just the flora. Even on the flora, I don't know whether this new species could be, well, conquering those areas. They could maybe absorb more CO2 or less, absorb less. I think you spoke about CO2 kidnapping. So this could be generating changes in the economy of the area. That's why I said that you answered partially, because Michele spoke now about the importance of shepherds, of traditional jobs, because if there's other species, they could change the underlayer of the forest, the pastures. That was my question. Thank you.
Very interesting question. And I will start saying that the first thing to be aware, like we mentioned before, genetic diversity. So we have species that have their own genetic diversity. So before arriving to change a species, we can change the provenance where we get the seeds to plant in the very same ecosystem, so that we don't make a completely new ecosystem, but we can have this diversity can help us. In many cases, and in the Mediterranean very often is an important case, the ecosystem that we have will not be able to survive, so that we'll have to move. And in the place where this ecosystem is no longer, we will need to allow new species to get in. This is one moment where science is really become very, very important. Science that can tell us what are the best species that can grow there, and species that are not invasive, species that don't make other bigger problem in the landscape. So science help us and help the practitioners in choosing what are the species they can choose and they can plant. But then we can use this in designing what is the new forest, what is the new landscape that we need to have. A landscape where we can also make use of all the timber that we produce. You know, a lot of the simplification that we have in European forest is that because we were used to make use of very, very few tree species. So all the other tree species were simply eliminated because they didn't have a market. Now, the technology that we have now allow us to make use of all the timber that we produce, all the species. So this is something that is really important, so that we don't have to push the ecosystem to serve our need. So we adapt our need to what the ecosystem can give us. And this is a very big change in mindset. Thank you.
I would like to use this question or use this moment to talk about the problem of invasive species, because this is a reality, and invasive species are transforming of ecosystems. They displace species. There's lots of examples in animals, and they are truly generating very serious problems precisely in those, well, not in forests. They are a bit more resistant to invasions, but when you have fragile ecosystems, such as some, like in the delta, wetlands, we know that there's invasive species, and that creates true problems with very important financial consequences, because the ecosystemic service is lost and all the economy behind that service is lost as well. So we need to be very watchful of what species are introduced in what sites and places. Luckily, in forest systems, there are cases in which there are species that behave as invasive species, but they are invasive of those spaces that have been very much disturbed. So when the ecosystem starts to recovers its naturalness, these species that could cause damage are normally displaced. Perfect. Yes. I hope I can organize the challenges that I want to set here for you in my head. Firstly, have you thought about how can we make rural appealing to the people from the city in the sense of sharing? I think that there are new business models regarding nature. And I'm saying this because we will always have to look for some sort of financial compensation that allows to bring population to forests, those agents or managers who are so necessary. This morning, I had a panel discussion with Avadio Green, and he mentioned that the Antioquia University, where he is, does not hold classes in the Paranymph, but rather in the rural area. You hold your course in your own habitat and you share for 15 days in a year the different spaces. How can we have friendlier spaces in the countryside, taking into account not just the advantages of that, but also the vital cycles of people? It's difficult to have a family in a rural environment when your children have to move. There are other reminiscent advantages. It's very difficult to be a shepherd and move when we have concentrated more on personal relationships. That's one. Second, how is the agriculture of forests seen? The agriculture, yes. An olive tree field or a vineyard, is that a forest? And to what extent is it a forest? And I'm saying this because, well, you know that from next year on, CO2 emissions will be regulated by the EU, and therefore this will generate new business models that obviously is very much related with the remuneration of some parties regarding the capturing or kidnapping of CO2. And thirdly, also within that scope, you know that company constitution models are being created, but basically capture CO2 in forests. They regenerate forests and they do this capturing and selling of CO2. Is this possible in terms of obtaining profitability for people who are in the territory, so that at least in some parts this revenue diversification could generate that resilience capacity that is necessary to remain in the countryside or in rural areas? We know that droughts are putting a lot of pressure and that lands are being more and more threatened in the entire Mediterranean, not just in Catalonia. We're talking about the north of Africa with lots of problems along those lines in terms of rethinking of crops. So this is also a rethinking of the entire ecosystem, and well, farmers and shepherds are protagonists. So how can we protagonize those of us who live in cities or who are in an urban development? How can we protagonize that change, that transformation?
A ver, bueno, puedo contestar algunas de las preguntas. Es que algunas son muy de opinión, porque
some are opinion-based questions and they don't really apply to my field, so I can express my opinion, but maybe Michele can answer some of the questions that you asked. Agriculture, whether it's forest or not, and whether it can participate in the CO2 kidnapping, that's clear. There'll be the new standards and regulations that will allow for that. There's the CO2 kidnap through agricultural soil, and all these things have now entered with a lot of strength, and truly there are many different ways to start kidnapping CO2 through agriculture, precisely changing some practices in a very simple fashion. Therefore, there's a long road ahead to maybe get compensations along these lines. And as for forests, or I thought you mentioned planting trees. It would be rather planting trees to capture CO2. We, and I'm speaking in general in CREAF, we don't like these initiatives too much. There's a bit of, well, we are a bit reluctant. Then the strategy, they say that they're going to plant 3 million trees, and I hope it's not here because we have lots of trees. Natural regeneration, well, forest regeneration is natural and it works, so we don't need to plant trees. But what could be done would be to find the way of compensating the owners that perform management that kidnap CO2. So incentivate not the planting of trees, but incentivate the management to kidnap CO2. And this basically is doing some calculations. There is a project called livelihoods, which dwells a lot on these solutions. And a business person basically buys climate credits. And those credits are good to pay the forest management in this or that forest. And behind that, there are some reports, some documents that say, well, if that is the management that you're going to perform, you are going to kidnap this amount of CO2. And not just CO2, but it also speaks about water, whether there's going to be more water or less water in the reservoirs, and also soil. So these are the things. I'm not into that, but I know about it. And I think it's a very interesting initiative. So I believe things should go along these lines, and this would be my answers to some of the questions you asked.
Maybe I can try to complement a little bit. We mentioned already several times this idea of paying for ecosystem services. This is pay for something that the ecosystem is doing for us. But the ecosystem, there is someone in the ecosystem. There is someone that manages the forest. There is someone that plant or cut the trees, someone that cultivate in a special way so that there will be more carbon in the soil. So all these kind of services, they need to be compensated in a way or another. So if we don't manage to find a way that we can compensate for these services, then we will always depend on, yes, the forest is managed in a way that is giving us all the services, but there is just one forest owner that is paying for all of this. And if you think of it, if I'm not the forest owner, I'm happy. But if I am the forest owner, I'm very disappointed. Why do I need to manage the forest in a way that it costs me more and that I don't even get enough money out of the timber that I can sell? Because then in 500 years, we will have a better world. You know, we need to be aware that this will require a big change in mindset in what we need to do. Well, then there will be many other things to say, but maybe there are more questions.
Y bueno, y para añadir alguna cosa más,
And just to add one more thing that we haven't said, forest management in the northern Mediterranean countries is not viable, economically speaking. Almost never you can do management, and that management will have financial profitability. So that is a long-term investment that, additionally, with the threats of droughts and fires, who is going to start investing? It is the example of the bad business. You want to invest in forest management? Well, please find a different business, because this is not a good one. I'm being very dramatic here, I know, but this is a bit of the explanation of why there's no forest management in our country and why we have denser forests with greater danger of drought, because we're truly not doing the necessary management for these forests to be able to recover a certain degree of health and vitality. Because 80% of forests in Catalonia are private. And there are small areas, small regions. There are some associations of owners now, some initiatives. And if some get together, they can do the management of several hectares, and they can gather all the timber, and, well, it's hard.
Allow me to remind again the great work that the Diputación de Barcelona is doing in this regard. Yes, there are some forest owners that try to find a way to collaborate each other, but then entities like the DIBA, they look themselves at areas that they are very fragile, or areas that can be very important to stop a forest fire, and they approach the forest owner and they compensate the forest owner in case cutting the timber is not going to pay off for the work. They make everything happen so that the forest can be managed. Is a way to pay for these ecosystem services. You know, in this way, we have an actor, DIBA, that recognizes that things will not happen on its own, but the service that we get as a community is an enormous service. So with this kind of action, they allow the forest to be managed, and then we will have many other actors in the landscape that can benefit of it. Things can either happen by their own if we pay for it, or we have a coordinator that makes all this action happening. And since I'm speaking again, you mentioned the fact that these 3 billion trees that need to be planted, who knows where, and the Catalan forest, they can regenerate a lot on their own. A possibility, and this is again goes to the responsibility of the individual forest manager, is seeing if there is enough of this regeneration. If some species have been completely removed by the humans because they have no use, and therefore some of these planting trees in the forest can be very important. So bringing back the diversity that we have lost. So more than planting new forests around the landscape. And remember that Catalonia is one of the most forested region in the whole of Europe. So planting, creating new forests in Catalonia is not a solution. And also forests are really a very, very important tool that we have to fight climate change. But this tool works differently in different parts of the world. In some part of the world, it's just absorbing as much CO2 as possible. In Catalonia, it's making the ecosystem more resilient. It's making sure that when it rains, the forest can absorb the water and then release it slowly in the time. This is much more important than the carbon can be sequestered. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Any other questions? Thank you, Michele. Well, I had a last question. We've talked a lot about the role of different stakeholders. We've spoken about forest management, and we need to have people there. Considering how complex this is and the Mediterranean ecosystem, what collaboration and interdisciplinary collaboration is needed. We have the academia, scientific evidence. We've spoken about the people who are there, out there implementing. So what is there missing? What do we have, or what will be needed so that collaboration can also accelerate this transformation, socially speaking? Well, what we have to do, scientists, now that we're here in our caves, would be to communicate potential solutions that we see that we have much more, especially regarding management of forest adaptation. And this means to go out there on the field, to be in touch with managers, with people who are in charge of managing our forests, with owners, etc., so that they can precisely communicate that knowledge and translate it into specific practices and actions that are real solutions on the reality of the country. And we don't truly do that. We do it very little. Some more than others, yes. But if I give you the example of the center where I work, there's probably half a dozen people who more or less do this, to be in touch with managers, with owners, with those who are truly managing the environment to contribute solutions. We have projects that attempt to do that transfer, and it's hard. Firstly, it's hard to speak the same language, and then it's hard for this to be understood, integrated, and applied.
Maybe I can complement a little bit with the broader pan-European picture. You mentioned before, for example, the genetic diversity, and I mentioned that in Europe we have a very strong collaboration in conserving the genetic diversity throughout the whole continent. And this is because genetic diversity varies within the species distribution range, and one country alone cannot conserve all this diversity. Therefore, it's really important to have this platform to collaborate the way so that we can see the full picture together and to develop strategies all together. In the moment of climate change that we mentioned, the species are moving north. It means that Norway is looking to Sweden, Sweden looking to Denmark, Denmark look to Germany, Germany to France, France to Spain. And then Spain, when you arrive here, then you have the sea. There is nothing else to look. This is why the collaboration also on the other side of Mediterranean becomes really crucial. Because they are facing now problem that we will have here in Catalonia much earlier than what we would like to have. So this is why it's important to have this platform where we can bring scientists together from all the sides of Mediterranean. And well, this is a little bit of self-promotion, but this is what we do at the European Forest Institute. We bring scientists. They face the very same problem, but with different perspectives from all the Mediterranean. And we can look at the problems together. We can share the knowledge, and then we can build strategy on and also support countries in conserving the diversity they have, because sooner or later we will need also this diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think with this we wrap up the session. I think it has been very interesting, very complete from different perspectives, and I really love the insights that you gave us today and the key messages. So thank you everyone for coming today, and we hope to keep in touch and keep discussing about and communicating about the pathway to climate resilient forest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.